We've got a new guest on today's program, and I'd like to say, Scott, one of your dear friends and mine, along with Gordon, our dear friend Tom Gildersleeve, is here today. So, the great Gildersleeve. Tom's good to see you. Welcome to our program. It's nice to have you in the audience for today's program. And so, a few more people are trickling in. I think what we'll do here in about another minute and a half is we're going to get this show on the road. And when other people come trickling in, I will just let them into the program. So, let's see here. Well, Dave Johnson, Mason City, Iowa, right down the street from you, Scott.
Oh,
Dave
indeed.
Johnson of Iowa Traction Frame fame is with us. And so, hey, everybody, it's nice having everybody back on the program here. So we are at 1 p.m. on the West Coast. So I think it's about time that I get this thing on the road before, like I say, people start leaving. So my name is Jonathan Fisher, your host and moderator for today's program. This is the resumption of the Pacific Northwest Railway Archive biweekly Zoom program where we have guests from around the country join us and talk about things that we are all interested in, which are trains. And so we've got an absolute, just fantastic guest to start this fall season's program, Scott Lothes. We'll get to Scott in a moment. I just want to go over a couple of sort of news and note items. First, we're recording the program, so if you could remember to stay muted while we're recording the program. And at the end, if you've got a question, this is a good button to use. It's down in your reactions chamber at the bottom of the page. So just a couple of scheduling items. Running concurrently with today's program is the first day of the NPRHA convention up in Everett, Washington. I'll be up there tomorrow checking out some of the festivities. And then next week at the same location in Everett, Washington is the Great Northern Historical Society convention. So they're kind of doing a 2-for-1 up there. Both are highly worthwhile. And I know the volunteers put in a lot of effort into making for a good set of conventions. So coming up on our schedule for this fall, September 25th, a equally engaging guest is Scott. Bethan Mayer, the executive director of the Mount Rainier Scenic Railway. This thing was deader than a doornail 12 months ago, and it has come roaring back to life. It's a really cool story. October 9th, we're scheduled to have Roy Hemingway. Roy is the past president of the Oregon Rail Heritage Center in Portland, Oregon. So that will hopefully be a great program. I will be in Chama, New Mexico on October 23rd. So our guest host will be Virginia Wright, our executive director here at PNRA, and she will be talking to our past board president, Bob Kelly, about, I believe, railroad lanterns. And so that's coming up. November 6th, Paul Dedalius, the president of Columbia Rail, will be on the program talking about him being a rail fan and owner of a railroad. So that should be an interesting one. November 20th, a perennial favorite on our program, J. Craig Thorpe. We all love Craig, and Craig's going to be back, and Craig's going to be talking about how artists like him create paintings. December 4th, a guest that I gotta thank Scott for putting me on the track of, Andrea Capiola. And she did a fantastic presentation for you folks at CRPA, and I'm looking forward to her. Can you want to just add a little emphasis on that for me?
Oh, we just really enjoyed getting to know her and her work. She brings a great eye to the railroad scene, kind of a new eye to it, and she does a really great job of photographing some of the maintenance operations that a lot of us
Wow.
don't pay as much attention to. She really follows around the track gangs and crews and has some great behind the scenes coverage of them, in addition to just wonderful coverage of the landscapes. And she volunteers at Mount Rainier as well, so
Yes,
she
she
has a good
does.
eye for the
Yes, as a matter of
preservation
fact,
aspect of
you
it too.
know,
So no, I always love seeing her work, and I'll sure try to tune into that. And I should also add that
yes.
your guest on November 6th, Paul Dedalius, is the person most responsible directly for getting me involved in railroad photography to start
Really?
with when we were undergraduates together at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. So I will
Oh
mark that
my.
on my calendar and sure try to tune in for
Yeah,
that one too.
absolutely. Or
Paul's a
or
dear friend and we go way back.
so also, as I mentioned, we're going to, thanks to my nephew Brent, who's on the program today, we're going to be putting this program on YouTube as soon as the program is over, and I'll let Brent type into the chat where we can find that program when we get to the end of the program. We're almost done. I got one more announcement, Scott, and then we're going to turn it over to you. December 18th, really, really exciting guest, and I want to make sure I pronounce his name correctly, Cesar Vergara. Cesar Vergara is an industrial designer born in Mexico City, and he designed the Amtrak Talgo trains, which run in the Cascades corridor here between Vancouver, BC, and Eugene, Oregon. Those sets are going to be retired, and Caesar is we're lucky to be able to get him as a guest. And I may be calling on my board president, Russell Holter, to actually help with that presentation, as those two guys are pretty good friends. So that kind of wraps up some of the background information that we've got. And Scott and anybody else in the audience, I'm always looking for we're booked up through the end of this calendar year, but I'm always looking for new folks and new faces. Tom's on the program. Maybe we can get Tom to share a few Milwaukee Road images and that sort of thing. So if you've ever got any ideas, please get a hold of me, Jonathan Fisher, jfisher@pnraarchive.org, and let me know. I've never met a potential guest that I didn't absolutely love. Speaking of guests that I actually do love, I'm going to turn it over to our guest presenter today, Mr. Scott Lothes. Scott, I'm going to mute and it's all yours, baby. And let's see here. Hang on, let me check my security. Share a screen is enabled, so you should be ready to go.
Okay, well, we'll start without some slides first for a few updates from the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. And Jonathan, thanks so much for the kind introduction and the opportunity to present. Should also blame Jonathan for encouraging me to share my own photography today, rather than my more normal path of digging through the center's archives, which I'm always really happy to do too. But I'm looking forward to this and to sharing some of my favorite railroad, the Oregon Trunk, with a lot of people who I know it well and maybe even better than me. But before we get into that, I do just want to go through a quick rundown of current happenings and recent and upcoming at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. We're based here in Madison, Wisconsin, but do programming all over the world, mostly the US, but occasionally internationally. Um, Two quick caveats that I will apologize for in advance. September in the upper Midwest has some of our best weather, except for my allergies. So if I need to take a quick pause for that, I'll apologize. And we also just adopted a new dog the day before yesterday. She is currently sleeping quietly on the futon next to me. But we're still getting used to her. So if I have to do anything with her real quick, we'll hopefully not take up too much time there. But at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, we just put our fall issue of Railroad Heritage in the mail. I know that's arriving in some members' mailboxes already. I think of regional interest to a lot of you. We have a great story in there by a good friend of mine, Kyle Weissman-Gee, of the industrial switch jobs in Portland, Oregon. Kyle's been tracking those down for about 15 years and has some incredible coverage of a lot of lines in Portland that haven't received a lot of attention. So look forward to that if you're a member of the center. If you're not, that's an easy thing to do. I can join on our website, and I will drop that in the chat. We are railphoto-art.org, and if you go to that support tab, that will take you straight to where you can sign on. And we always send out the most recent issue of Railroad Heritage to our new members. So if you want to get that, you can join. We'll also have back issues available for sale on the website too. Um, we have our own Zoom programs. We do these monthly in the evenings. They typically start at 7 p.m. Central Times. That's a little earlier, 5 p.m. Pacific. We also record these and put them on our website. Our next one is coming up this coming Tuesday, September 17th. And that's going to be a deep dive into some of the color photography in our Richard Steinheimer collection. I know all of us know Stein's work very well, but especially on the black and white side. And we're going to be sharing color work from some of his trips over Donner Pass in primarily the 80s and 90s. Some really incredible work of the last couple of decades of Southern Pacific action there by someone who knew the area incredibly well and had a lot of inside access to it. So that's going to be September 17th. That is a members only program. So you do need to be a member of the center to join for that one. And again, easy way to take care of that too. Um, We've been doing a little bit more to honor the art part of our name in recent past. Over the summer, we had an art exhibition from the collection of one of our board members, Peter Moss, who's pledged that work to come to us. That was at the Herschel and Adler Galleries in New York City in July and August. We had two receptions there. It was all very well received, and we're looking forward to doing more like that. We've got another great opportunity coming up soon. Kalmbach Media did not sell their corporate art collection to Firecrown. That was not included. They were looking for a new home for that, and they chose us. And we are very grateful and humble recipients of that collection that includes 58 original railroad paintings, uh, Ted Rose, Gil Reed, George Gloff, and others' work is included in that. Many of these works were done as commissions for covers for trains, for some of their books, for illustrations in many of their publications. So we're really excited about that. We are hoping to put together a traveling exhibit from that that can go to venues all over the country, possibly starting as early as next year. So stay tuned for more information about that. Um, at our offices here in Madison, we're working on several collections right now. Primarily, we're working on the Steinheimer collection, Jim Shaughnessy, Henry Posner III, and Carl Zimmerman. Those are the ones we're most actively processing. We have several more that are going to be coming that we'll be getting started on soon, and we try to share updates for those on social media and our collections portal. We're on most of the major platforms of social media at Rail Photo Art. And you can follow those for most of our updates. We're going to be doing a new book this fall featuring photography by our founder, John Gruber, of his coverage of the Burlington steam excursions in the 1960s. And John really brought his photojournalistic and human interest to this and captured those excursions in a way that really shows the people that were making them happen and the many fans and enthusiasts that were out watching them. So he really captured kind of the energy of that moment and what a cultural phenomenon those excursions were. And we had an article about this in the summer issue of our magazine, and we're really excited to be turning it into a softcover book. So look for announcements about that later this fall too. The only other announcements I'll have before we start my actual program is our Conversations Conference. The next one of those, 2025, is going to be May 16th through the 18th, and that's going to be again at our regular partner venue of Lake Forest College in Lake Forest, Illinois, just north of Chicago. So again, that's going to be May 16th to the 18th of 2025. We'll open registrations for that right after the first of the year. The last two had sold out by the end of February. So if you want to come, try to register early, and we'll hope to see you there. So without further ado, we'll take a little trip down the Oregon trunk, and I'm just going to do my share screen to get started for that. Let's see. Does that look good to everybody? Okay, let me. We're seeing the full screen there.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, I always just want to make sure about that. All right. Well, we're going to head now to Central Oregon and to a railroad that haunts me more than most. And I know a lot of you are familiar with this place and probably have your own stories of frustration out there in that beautiful high desert country of North Central Oregon. This show runs about 40 minutes in total, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. We're starting here with the alpenglow of May 10th, 2011, which was just hitting Mount Jefferson at 5:45 that morning. As I'm sure you can appreciate, there wasn't going to be a train through here for another 4 hours, but I didn't need one for this shot, especially with those great old searchlight signals. A lot of railroad tours are linear, but I've arranged this one as a journey through time to run chronologically. And we'll start with a little bit of background. I know this is familiar to most of you, though. The Oregon Trunk runs from the Columbia River at Wishram, Washington, up the Deschutes River to Bend, Oregon. It's the consolidation of two railroads built in a great competition between James J. Hill and E.H. Harriman in the early 20th century. And if you're not familiar with this book, I really recommend it, The Deschutes River Railroad War by Leon Spearoff, who tells that story quite well. And the maps that I'm sharing here, I've shamelessly pulled from the rails.guide site, which is a wonderful site for both contemporary and classic rail lines. So the Oregon Trunk eventually became part of a north-south link between the Pacific Northwest and Southern California. BNSF calls it their Inside Gateway. It's really a hodgepodge of routes that includes 3 stretches of Union Pacific track and trades, some granted as a condition of their 1996 merger with Southern Pacific. The UP's I-5 corridor is the principal north-south line on the West Coast, and the Inside Gateway provides an alternative, albeit about 200 miles longer. It's 152 miles from Wishram to Bend, which is the focus of this program, and it climbs about 3,500 feet in that distance. The railroad single track with sidings, most of which are only about 5,000 feet long. Most of the tonnage moves south. BNSF will run non-clearing southbounds, but all of the northbounds have to fit the sidings. And until 2018, this was track warrant control with automatic block signaling and manual switches. Listening to track warrants on the scanner was the best way to know what was happening and a big part of the experience out there on the Oregon Trunk. CTC came to this line in 2018, and I missed the old searchlight signals and miss hearing those track warrants on the radio even more. Now, geographically, this is really a railroad in 3 parts. There's first the Deschutes River Canyon from Wishram to South Junction, and then there's the climb out of it on that, a 1.5% grade of Trout Creek Canyon that required helpers in the steam era. And then there are the irrigated fields up on the Columbia Deschutes Plateau the rest of the way to Bend. Now, if you're wondering why there are names like North and South Junction with no sign of any connecting lines, that's a legacy of those 2 competing railroads. That stretch is so rugged that the competitors reluctantly agreed to share a single track there, and North Junction is where their lines came together, and South Junction is where they split back apart. The hill route comprises most of what remains, but the Harriman line was superior from South Junction to Metolius, leading to this fun fact, and that's to this day, Union Pacific owns those 24 miles and leases them to BNSF. Now, at least in my experience, the primary trains are 2 pairs of daily manifests, one for Pasco in Eastern Washington, and then another for Western Washington, typically Vancouver or Everett. Their terminals on the other end is usually Barstow, but I've also seen Bakersfield, Fresno, and Riverbank. Now, when I was doing most of my photography, there were 2 locals based out of Bend, a morning job that worked to Redmond, and then an afternoon job that went further north to Madras. They have since been consolidated into a single job. There are also extra trains. In my experience, the not very photogenic bear tables are the most common, with a few of those running per week when I was there. But there were others that were less frequent and more interesting. Those included unit grain and canola meal trains going south. There are empty cars coming back north, too long for the sidings, and so usually split into 2 sections. So that's kind of what to expect, but of course, each day out there is different. I spent a lot of time there over the past 22 years, and especially in the late spring and summer of 2011, right before Maureen and I moved from Oregon to Wisconsin. When we found out we were going to be moving, I realized that if I was ever going to shoot the Oregon Trunk the way I'd always wanted to, it was probably then or never. And another advantage of all those 2011 trips was that I'd made some railroader friends who were willing to provide me with some train information. I can't name them, but they have my profound gratitude for helping make some of these trips possible. And Maureen joined me for 2 of those trips, and that's us at Smith Rock State Park in Terrebonne, Oregon. I'll only be showing photos up through 2011. I'm still kind of figuring out how to add more recent trips to this story. And a shout out to Dale Sanders, who's on here today. My inspiration to see the Oregon Trunk came from the 2-part article he published in CTC Board magazine in 2001. And that is Brian Rutherford's cover shot of Willow Creek Trestle at Madras. Both he and co-author Greg Brown extolled the Oregon Trunk's incredible scenery and lamented its infrequent trains, cautioning that long waits and frustration were to be expected. Now, my first encounter with the OT was anything but frustrating. I was on a big road trip following college graduation in June of 2002, and driving into the canyon one sunny afternoon, I heard the dispatcher setting up a meet at Oak Brook, just north of Tunnel 2, signature spot where those two bridges cross the river on either side of the tunnel. So I climbed up there, and within an hour, I had these two shots, a BNSF mixed freight coming north, and then UP's Ben Local going south. Neat train that was sadly abolished a couple of years later. After getting these two shots so quickly, I remember thinking, what's so hard about photographing the Oregon trunk? Well, I spent a pleasant night at the Trout Creek campground and then spent the entire day out there the next day and saw no more trains. It would take me 5.5 years to return when Maureen and I moved to Oregon. This is February 2008, when Union Pacific's Cascade line was closed by a massive slide and they detoured 2 or 3 pairs of trains a day over the Oregon trunk. This one's the QPWRV running from the Portland and Western Railroad to Roseville, California. You can see lumber off the West Side branch, and then also those blue boxcars, craft paper from the mill in Toledo at the back. Turning around, we see the DPU shoving across the second bridge as the train heads up the canyon. Shearer's Falls, which we'll see later, is just around that distant bend. I slept in my car that night so I could keep shooting. This is a southbound just before midnight with a block signal glowing red at left. I spent the next day in the Columbia Gorge, though, and I made no more efforts to see any more of these detours, which lasted into early May. Now, this was the busiest the Oregon trunk has ever been, and I still haven't forgiven myself for not paying any more attention to it. I came back in May, right after the detours ended. Great timing on my part. Maureen joined me for a long weekend camping trip, and our friend Cameron Settlemeyer met us for part of it. This is a southbound at dawn on the first morning when I climbed the hillside above our campsite. It's tricky light and not quite the angle I was hoping for, but on the Oregon trunk, you do what you can. Now, it sounded like they were about to meet a northbound, so I hung out on the hillside for a couple of hours, but nothing showed up. We finally saw that northbound at Shearer's Falls as we were driving south at midday. I pulled over for this grab shot of the tail end, which was all I could manage, and then also to shout a few inappropriate for radio words against the canyon walls out of frustration there. We saw no more trains the rest of that day, nor for most of the next. But we did enjoy checking out the Needle Depot at Gateway, which sadly has since been demolished. Just before sunset of the second day, we caught a southbound passing Mount Jefferson in the field south of Madras. It was meeting a northbound welded rail train, so Cameron and I decided to try for a silhouette shot on Willow Creek Trestle. And for once, the timing there was perfect. This shot kind of redeemed what was otherwise my most frustrating trip to the Oregon trunk. But the railroad still had to remind us once more of some of those frustrations. We went to sleep in our tents that night with our scanners running, intent on getting out for a night shot of anything that might come. And we were surprised when we both woke to daylight after hearing nothing on the scanners. No trains had run all night, and there wouldn't be another one until 11 o'clock the next morning. By then, the clouds had rolled in, so we stayed at camp and just listened to it whistling across the plateau before heading home, hoping for better luck next time. Now, next time for me came 3 months later in September, when I used a trip to the Columbia Gorge to shoot the Oregon Trunk Bridge at Wishram. This southbound surprised me just before sunset. It's not where I wanted to shoot it, but it's kind of the best I could do with the telephoto. Now, this is where I'd wanted to be, up on the Oregon side, looking down on the bridge, and that's I-84 at right and the lights of Wishram, Washington at center. You can drive right to this spot on a washboarded dirt road, and I slept up here in my car that night, once again with the scanner running. There were 2 trains, both coming north, and this was the first of them, streaking across the bridge a little before midnight. I'd been excited to try some night shots here, but I hadn't counted on that incredibly bright light out there on the drawbridge. Zooming in allowed me to crop that light out, while also highlighting the play of headlights against the basalt cliffs. The Y at the north end of the bridge allows trains to go either way on the Fallbridge subdivision main line. This one's waiting for permission to head west through Vancouver. And here's the second one, turning east for Pasco at 2:15 a.m. Let me just say here that when you're sleeping restlessly in your car on the side of a dirt road hoping for night trains, there is no sweeter sound than a conductor toning up the dispatcher on the radio. It took me a little while to rouse myself from the driver's seat, but once awake and outside, the gorge by starlight was incredible. But I was still glad to see the first hint of dawn and head off into the new day, which I spent in the gorge. Nearly a year passed before I returned to the trunk, this time for a camping trip with another good friend, Mark Incy, in May of 2009. Trains were as bad as ever, but by now I was expecting that, and so I was able to enjoy the experience of being there a lot more. Each day we got a southbound in the high sun of early afternoon and not much else. On the first day, we climbed the canyon above Tunnel 2 for this view, which is interesting but not very flattering in the harsh light. We actually saw more snakes than trains on this trip. This one's an utterly benign bull snake crossing the access road. We also went looking for traces of the long-gone Harriman route, finding some crossed eyes near a caved-in tunnel bleached by the high desert sun for more than 80 years since they'd felt the weight of a train. We also found an old camp car that had been turned into a fishing cabin down there by the river. And here's our early afternoon southbound on the second day, crossing the first bridge at Tunnel 2. We'd both already taken the standard shot there, so we tried this higher and more straight-on angle to emphasize the canyon. And then we quickly repositioned for the DPUs, shoving away across the second bridge. In this 3-day trip, this was the only day when we got a second train in daylight. We heard the dispatcher setting up a meet between this southbound and a northbound somewhere up the canyon. So we compared distance to running time and drove around looking for a spot where the sun would last as long as possible. It was close, but we got it. If you're wondering why I keep coming back to this lonely railroad, bake in the hot afternoons, watch out for snakes, and bang my head against the canyon walls in frustration, scenes like this is why. It's for the way that cold, clear water sparkles in the low sun, for the play of light and shadow on the basalt, for the hope, always small but never zero, that a train might appear in those magical moments. Now, permit me here a brief literary interlude. With a blank screen and words by Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was a complicated person, but he had some great insights into certain aspects of the human condition and a well-honed gift for conveying them in words. Now, this is from the end of a story called Big Two-Hearted River, where protagonist Nick Adams, just back from World War I, goes on a solo fishing trip. Ahead, the river narrowed and went into a swamp. The river became smooth and deep, and the swamp solid with cedar trees, their trunks close together, their branches solid. And Nick did not want to go in there now. He felt a reaction against deep wading with the water deepening up under his armpits to hook big trout in places impossible to land them. In the swamp, the banks were bare, the big cedars came together overhead, and the sun did not come through except in patches. In the fast, deep water, in the half-light, the fishing would be tragic. In the swamp, fishing was a tragic adventure. The next day, Mark and I went for a hike in the morning sun, undisturbed by the passing of any trains. But this is a place called Beavertail, 9 winding miles north of Tunnel 2, where the river and the railroad sweep through a pair of horseshoe bends. We wanted to see whether it might be possible to climb to the top of the canyon for a view of that scene. We went far enough to determine that it was, and then we filed that away with the hope of coming back. But life took us in other directions, and nearly 2 years would pass before I made it back to the Oregon trunk. I think about it, though, that swift, clear water calling like a siren in my dreams. In January of 2011, I headed into the Columbia Gorge for a day with Kyle Weissman-Yee. We learned of 2 southbounds called out of Wishram and headed south to catch them near Shearers Falls. This is the first one, where the access road turns off from Route 216. I prefer the going away shot with the columnar basalt and the shadows ready to swallow the train in their depths. The river flows over bedrock here, and the falls are just around the next bend. That second southbound never showed up, though. Luckily, we figured that out in time to make it back to the gorge for sunset. My longing for this railroad had been fully reawakened, though. Now, the rest of that winter and early spring was busy with work, but by the end of April, Maureen and I made a weekend trip back to the trunk. I still hadn't seen its signature bridge over the Crooked River, and change seemed to be in the air for us. She'd finished her master's degree at Oregon State a year earlier and was about to wrap up a 1-year appointment at Marylhurst University. We weren't yet sure where life would take us next, but we knew it might not be in Oregon. On this trip, Ben launched a northbound around noon on both days, and not much else in daylight. This is the Saturday train dropping into Trout Creek Canyon, and those containers on the headpin carry garbage from Klamath Falls, bound for that big landfill in Roosevelt, Washington. We stayed in Madras, but not at the shuttered Madras Hotel, and we spent some time exploring the town. Much of it appeared to be for sale, including most of the city block. Further south, we found a happier scene in Terrebonne, where the depot had been beautifully restored and turned into a restaurant. On Sunday, I got my shot of a train crossing the Crooked River, running high and brown from the spring rains. At 320 feet, this was the second highest railroad bridge in the world when it opened in 1911. We followed this train north, and I had time to climb partway up Trout Creek Canyon for this view. Neither the light nor the angle were perfect, but I was already making plans for my next trip. Knowing we might be leaving Oregon soon, I had started to wrap up most of my freelance work and make time in the middle of the weeks for photography. I devoted May 9th through 12th to the trunk, leaving our Oregon City apartment early enough to arrive in the fields near Madras at sunrise. There were no trains, but I heard of a southbound leaving Wishram. I found it at Maupin, where it had to set out a bad-ordered car in the little-used siding there. Maupin was one of the first Central Oregon communities to embrace the new recreation economy, and it's become a hub for rafting and fishing, so those vacation homes sprawling up the hill attest. So here's that train, Pasco to Riverbank, climbing the grade of Trout Creek under one of those stunning western skies. Slow progress let me see it again, crossing Willow Creek Trestle in Madras, where the shadows and light once again cooperated. It had to meet a northbound, so I stayed put. And here's that northbound Barstow to Pasco train a couple of hours later under heavier skies. It was tempting to chase this train back into the canyon, but being a weekday, I had another target. But the local out of Bend, crossing the Crooked River with 7 cars as the clouds dissipated. They stopped in Culver to spot 2 covered hoppers at the elevator there, and then continued north into Metolius past this disintegrating barn. The industrial park in Madras still has a few customers, and I tried to figure out the trackage as the crew went about their switching. Here they're backing past an abandoned warehouse to spot those 2 bulkhead flats. Now, the old heads weren't exactly friendly, but at least they appeared tolerant of my camera. There were 2 great benefits of chasing the local. First, it's a great target in its own right, and second, its presence kept me well apprised of anything else that might be happening. So I knew well in advance that before this train could head back south, they had to wait in Madras for this northbound Bakersfield to Pasco train. I had just enough time to climb from the road down there up the side of Willow Creek Canyon for this shot. There were no drones back in 2011. Then I caught the local passing my favorite pair of signals while switching in Metolius. And then rolling through the field south with 7 cars to take back to Bend. That made 5 train movements for the day, 3 road freights plus the local each way, and that was by far my best day yet on the Oregon trunk. I spent the next morning exploring Bend. I missed a southbound, which I still regret, but this was still a good decision. Bend is essential to the Oregon trunk story, and I had to get there at some point. At left is the powerhouse of the Brooks Scanlon Lumber Company's sawmill, which cut some 250 million board feet of lumber per year back at its peak in the 1930s, when it employed about 2,000 people. Trains brought in the logs and hauled away the lumber. The mill closed in 1994 after the forests had been exhausted. And then at lower right is the Stone Oregon Trunk Depot from 1911. It was moved a mile from the tracks in 1999 to make room for a new highway. Today it houses an art center. Upper right is the new yard office that replaced it. Now, it was tempting to chase the local again that afternoon, but I had other photography plans back in Trout Creek. There was a train coming from each direction, and I climbed all the way to the top of the promontory to see them. Now, the light was still pretty high for this Barstow to Vancouver northbound, but it was looking decent when Pasco to Barstow came up the grade a couple of hours later. I do have to confess to a composite image here. I needed 13 more car links to get both ends of the train in just the right spots, so forgive me for the Photoshop trickery. I wanted a night shot, so I'd lugged my camping gear up here, and I watched the light get better for the next 3 hours. There's almost a shadow box effect in the canyon here before the sun drops behind the distant ridge. But of course, there weren't any more trains, just the local switching in Madras, 20 miles away. So I pitched my tent, made dinner on my camp stove, and hoped the scanner would wake me from my restless sleep. At 3 in the morning, I got my wish when the first half of an empty canola meal train dropped down the grade in this 20-minute exposure. Clouds had rolled in overnight, and the lights on the horizon come from Warm Springs, 10 miles away. This train had to meet a southbound somewhere down in the canyon, far enough away that a dawn appearance seemed likely, so I set my alarm and tried to get a little more sleep. That southbound came grinding up the grade a little before 7, and this time no Photoshop was necessary to enhance the train length. This was a train I'd really wanted to catch, a big grainer out of Montana, wrapping the curves all the way down to the river as the morning sun found a thin spot in the clouds. And I have to tell you, I'd been a little anxious up there that night, especially the couple of times a pickup truck came down the road. I never slept soundly, but that night still ranks as one of my most memorable Oregon experiences. I waited for the DPUs to pass, and since I'd already broken camp and packed everything except my camera, I was able to get back down to the car pretty quickly, which was all fine, just as I'd left it, and then catch this train again at the Crooked River, where the morning sun was casting a wonderful shadow of the old highway bridge on the canyon wall. There wouldn't be any more trains until afternoon, so I went back to the official campground, repitched my tent, and slept like a rock for the next 3 hours. After splashing myself awake in the lake there and getting some lunch, I caught this southbound passing irrigation equipment under heavy skies in the fields near Gateway. Those clouds favored staying on the plateau, and I knew the local would be coming. And here it is, approaching Metolius. I'm glad I had enough foresight to shoot the pole line then. It's gone now. And you can see some holes starting to open up in the sky. And the sun dropped under them just before setting as an Everett to Barstow train rolled south through the fields near Culver. The local was right behind it, stopping to pick up a few hoppers in the last minutes of sunlight. And then here they are departing in the day's afterglow. I swear they were putting on a show for me. They slow rolled right up to this point where they notched out the throttle and left town in a roar. They had good reason to hurry because the northbound was waiting in the next siding. It was the second half of that empty canola meal train, and I went low at Willow Creek to get it against the twilight sky with a waxing moon behind those thin clouds. The sky looked incredible in the moonlight. I stopped along the old highway south of Metolius for a shot with the block signals before heading back to the campground, calling it a night. The next day was the last of the trip. It was pretty quiet that day. I scouted out the City of Prineville Railway, even though they were hardly running anything at all in 2011. This is Prineville Junction, just north of Redmond, looking west toward Prineville. My first train that day was the local late in the afternoon at the Crooked River Bridge. That's Oregon's Black Butte on the horizon at left. Bend finally launched northbound, and I framed it with some irrigation equipment in the fields near Culver. This is a riverbanked Pasco train with more trash from Klamath Falls on the head end. And I stuck around for the local heading back south just before the hazy sunset. That's Black Butte again at right with Mount Washington in the distance at left. The drive home to Oregon City was about 2.5 hours, but I didn't mind at all after such a good trip. I came back the very next week, although just for 2 days this time. My first train was this northbound, dropping down the grade into Gateway early in the afternoon of May 18th. And there was a second northbound following that one an hour and a half later. Now from here I went south for 2 reasons. One was that I wanted to catch the local again. More importantly, I had my phone interview for the Center for Rapid Photography and Arts Executive Director position that afternoon. I needed a good place to take the call. I did that from the rest area at the Crooked River Bridge, watching the local roll north before the call ended, not getting so distracted that I botched the interview. The interview ran long, and I felt good about it, and I still had time to catch the local coming back south that evening after the sun dropped under the retreating clouds. There was a southbound close behind it, which I shot in the S-curve coming into Metolius, and they stopped there to make a set out in the house track. So I grabbed this shot of the conductor lining the switch in front of a cloud-covered Mount Jefferson. You can see his lantern on the ground and the broom and shovel hanging on the post at left. These hand-throw switches were a big part of the OT, and I sure wish I'd shot more of them. Just glad I took this one. Another thing I didn't shoot nearly enough were the searchlight signals. Now, these were at the south end of the Crooked River Bridge, where I'd returned to sleep in my car in hopes of getting a night shot or two. For anyone who's read the book Stations by Michael Flanagan, he talks about what's called the geography of longing. And this picture always kind of conveys my longing for the Oregon trunk, with the empty track running to the horizon and a block signal glowing green in the twilight, ever anticipating the next train. That southbound came along about an hour later, but this shot didn't really work out the way I wanted. Too much of the bridge was lost in the shadows. But there was a northbound Table train at 4 in the morning. This is kind of more of what I had in mind, with the lights lighting up the basalt cliffs and kind of shining through the bridge girders. And this is also the best use I ever found for one of those interminable Table trains. I caught up with the local heading south that morning near Redmond with two of the three sisters in the background. This is the only time I ever shot the morning job, and its territory ran through a lot of sprawl, but now I wish I'd done more with it. The trunk was flush with Table trains that day, and I followed this one into Trout Creek Canyon. It would meet the southbound Everett to Barstow at Dixon late enough for some of that shadow box effect to appear in the canyon. A little later would have been better still, but this is so far the best I've done at this spot. I followed this train back south, where it would meet yet another Table, the third of the day, approaching Metolius with Mount Bachelor on the horizon at right. As soon as the Table passed, the southbound's conductor lined his train out of the siding. This is the only shot I ever took on the OT with a locomotive splitting a pair of searchlight signals. I guess better one than zero. I raced ahead for a shot with one of the many irrigation canals as the light just kept getting better. And stuck around for the local, even though it was returning light engine on this day. 3 weeks later, I came back with some pretty big plans. Mark and I had decided that if we were ever going to shoot that double horseshoe, this was the time to do it. You can see our car way down there on the road leading to the Beaver Tail campground. And here's the view, with the first of two northbounds that afternoon. We'd hoped for glinting sunlight, but the clouds had other ideas. They'd started to part, but not quite enough for the second northbound, which was yet another Table. 20 minutes later, we got our light, but of course by then we were out of trains. Here's home for the night. The wind really howled up there in the early evening. We got a southbound around 10 p.m. I'd wanted to shoot a long exposure, but the wind was still so strong that I didn't think it would work. So I took a series of short exposures instead to make a time lapse. The wind died down as soon as this train passed, and we sat in silence for a long time, listening to it climb through the canyon. I was thrilled to be up there with one of my best friends, but photographically, I still wanted more. And this time we got it. There was a northbound just as dawn's first light bled into the sky at 3:30 that morning. But 20 minutes later, it would have been too bright and this shot wouldn't have worked. There was another northbound an hour behind it, passing into half-light that is neither night nor day. We just laid in the tent listening to it. We'd already had 5 trains here, more than we dared expect, but we still wanted one more. The southbound had been on duty at Wishram since 2 a.m., and we hoped it might fall down enough to pass us after sunrise. When the dispatcher ran this northbound all the way in and held the second one at Lockett, we knew we might have a chance. And here comes that southbound at 7:45 under partly cloudy skies, which, for once, cleared just in time. Hiking up here had taken 2 hours and covered more than 1,200 feet of elevation. We had no business seeing 6 trains in 15 hours, and the 2 best shots were on a knife edge between success and failure. This made up for a lot of those near misses in the past. There's one more shot before this train disappears into the canyon. Big Pasco to Barstow with 94 cars and 6 locomotives running 4x2. You can again see the speck of our Corolla down there just below it, the hand-carved-in tunnel portal on the long-gone Harriman line, bottom middle. People camping by the river probably had a more relaxing night, but they didn't get a view like this. It clouded over completely right after that. We were still marveling at catching that sunbreak as we posed to mark the occasion before hiking back down. I love what I get to do at the center and the life that Maureen and I have built in Wisconsin, but man, I sure miss the Oregon trunk sometimes. But the rest of the day was nearly an afterthought. Even catching a track geometry train near Gateway felt anticlimactic. Another southbound manifest followed it, and we pulled back for a big blue-green view across the fields at Paxton. A northbound left Bend that afternoon, and we waited on the old highway bridge over the Crooked River for a backlit silhouette under that wonderful late spring sky. We camped by the river that night, and a bear table came south soon after sunrise. This train wasn't too exciting, but it did produce some radio chatter that let us know another southbound was following it, which we called at camp at Trout Creek in classic morning light. I climbed up to this vantage point 4 times that spring, but I haven't been back there since. Still a great place to watch a train, though. You also have to watch where you step. On the way down, we came across this juvenile rattler, interrupting its breakfast of fresh mouse. For a couple of quick shots, we let it be, and I hope it was able to finish its meal in peace. This is the only rattlesnake I ever saw while hiking in Oregon, but I was always vigilant and wore heavy boots even on the hottest summer days. I made one more trip on my own at the end of June, mainly to shoot Shearer's Falls, where DPUs shove a southbound past one of the fishing platforms still used by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. I wanted better light, though, and luckily I had some other trains, as well as some rafters, seen here floating under the bridge at Tunnel 2. Still something I'd love to do someday. Late that afternoon, under heavy skies, another train headed south, with rear DPUs facing the proper direction this time. With no other trains in the picture for a while, I decided to follow this one south. And that was a doubly good move because I also caught the local leaving Madras behind a pair of Cascade green Jeeps. That lead unit is the 1519, and that is a GP28M that began life in 1959 as a Great Northern GP9. So that train was worth another shot out along the old highway, even if we got photobombed by a pickup. It kind of fits the scene, though. I went back to Crooked River for the southbound manifest, where the light, the sky, and a falcon did the kind of things that make Central Oregon so alluring. Sunset was a stunner, and there was another southbound out of Wishram, but it took too long to get here for that light. Finally came by nearly an hour after sunset. They had to meet a northbound somewhere before Bend, and knowing this might be my last trip to the trunk before we moved east, I wasn't about to let sleep get in the way of any photography. So here's that northbound crossing Trout Creek a few minutes before midnight, as the heavens appear to spin around Polaris in the high desert night. Went back to the falls the next day for an afternoon southbound, the Everett Barstow. After all the high-angle shots in the canyon, I'm glad I took a few river-level views, too. This one was needing a northbound, and the best thing I could think to do was return to Tunnel 2, where, despite increasing cloud cover, the sun was out, and the trailing unit was noteworthy, Pacific Harbor Line 67, probably heading to Motive Power Inc. in Boise for rebuilding. And better still, this Barstow to Pasco train had rear-facing DPUs, and I got to redo one of my first shots on the trunk almost 9 years to the day later, with better skies. And this, of course, is the cover on the new Railfan and Railroad. This is a Western Bluebird at my campsite the next morning. It's a little out of focus, but still a nice memento from the last night I've camped along the Oregon trunk. I didn't know then that it would be my last night there, but I knew it might be. This was the last day of June, mostly cloudy morning that could break open at any moment, and a friend had let me know of a southbound at Wishram. A shot would be nice, but I'd shot this railroad well over the past 2 months. What I wanted was, more than anything, was to go for another hike and peer into the canyon one more time. I drove north on 97 to a trailhead on the BLM's Criterion Tract, an abandoned ranch that extends out to the rim. I shouldered my pack and started walking, under a sky still thick with clouds, and not knowing whether I'd missed the southbound or even if it might still be sitting in Wishram. After 3.5 miles on the trail in a little over an hour, I reached the edge, and a few minutes later the train arrived, right as the clouds parted. The view here looks south from Dixon Siding, about halfway between Wishram and Bend. And this is an 88-car Pasco to Barstow with 7 engines running 4x3. Just beyond where the tracks and river disappear for the last time is North Junction, and the distant canyon wall is above South Junction, where the climb up Trout Creek begins. The westernmost peaks of the Ochoco Mountains mark the horizon, Most prominent is Grizzly Mountain, just left of center, 5,629 feet high and 40 miles away between Prineville and Terrebonne. Author Rebecca Solnit has an essay called The Blue of Distance. In it, she writes, "The color of that distance is the color of an emotion, the color of solitude and of desire, the color of there, seen from here, the color of where you are not, and the color of where you can never go." A week and a half later, I met up with Cameron one more time before Maureen and I moved to Wisconsin. We planned to shoot the Weyerhaeuser logging line in Longview, but it didn't run, so we headed for the Columbia Gorge. There we found a Canadian canola mule train heading east at Horse Thief Lake as a UP intermodal rolled west on the Oregon side. This was a trunk train. If the crew change at Wishram took long enough, not too long, we just might catch it crossing the river. The lead engine is above UP's Portland subdivision main line, and the connection between it and the trunk is at bottom right. That's the track those detour trains used in 2008, and the track the Bend Local once used 3 times per week each way. I suspect it's pretty rusty these days, but it's still there, just in case. Panning to the right and going wider, you can see the entire 100-car train. The railroad it just left is the Fallbridge subdivision, and Fallbridge was the name of Wishram until 1926. That name comes from the bridge that is still there and from the falls that are not. Until the gates of the Dalles Dam closed on March 10, 1957, Celilo Falls thundered over a staircase of ledges that dropped the Columbia 80 feet and half a mile, right here. It's not very high among the world's big waterfalls, but in terms of flow volume, Celilo was the 6th largest in the world. Salmon swimming upstream to spawn had to leap those falls, and their run supported one of the longest continuously inhabited settlements in North America, spanning some 15,000 years. The word Celilo appears in the languages of several tribes, and it roughly means the echo of water falling over rocks, but today not even that echo remains. What I heard was the wind, the traffic on I-84, and the trains. One native interviewed by Oregon Public Broadcasting described Celilo as 20 times louder than a train if you lived right next to the tracks. The trains are loud even from up here. You can only imagine the sound of the falls. Even harder to imagine, if you'd grown up hearing them, is the sound of their silence. So one more shot of this train. Zooming in, we see all of it passing the casino run by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. And around the bend, this train will turn into the shadowy Deschutes Canyon and follow it south into the night. Cameron and I had one more day together, and we ended on top of a tunnel back on the Fallbridge sub. In the very last moments of sunlight, with shadows hitting the causeway, we got a train. The Everett to Barstow, bound for a crew change at Wishram and an overnight run of the Oregon trunk. As Maureen and I packed up our lives in the days that followed, I shot a few more trains in Portland, but this was the last train from the last day when I photographed the Northwest as someone who lived there. One more quote from Rebecca Solnit. She says, "Blue is the color of longing for the distances you never arrive in, for the blue world." Can feel some of that blue inside me when I think of the Northwest and the Oregon trunk. Thank you for letting me share some of it with you today. That's it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm back, and gosh, I mean, guys, I mean, that was just fantastic. I mean, that was as good as I thought it would be, Scott. It's just outstanding.
Thank you.
And of course, a man with a lot more A talent and B ambition than yours truly. I mean, I've been to some of those places and I'm just going, wow, you went where? So yes, absolutely incredible program. Just fantastic. So do we have any questions? Anybody from the audience? We're about 5-10 minutes to the top of the hour. George Foster, did you ever run a UP train down there?
Yeah, so in a little follow-up, I was on the extra board at Hinkle, and even though what we call the Sandy between Portland and Hinkle was not originally our territory, we got a labor agreement that allowed us to either go all the way to the Dalles and dog catch trains anywhere east of that to go to Hinkle, or we could do what they said, like just drag a train out of Hinkle and put it away in a siding for a crew later to take, if there was overflow. And then the other deal with we would get the QETHK out of Canada, and then they would reconfigure that train in Hinkle and make the QHKRV out of it. And at that time, I retired in 2011, but before that, we would run either 2 or 3 motors on the west end of the train and 2 on the back, and then either take the train all the way to the Dalles and put it away on the south side. And when we did that, we'd also, if I remember correctly, we would swap ends. So we'd have to knock the DPUs down and then bring them back up so they could go east to OT Junction. But it became more common for us to run to OT Junction, and it would be the Dalles crew would get on there, and then I'd knock down the DPUs and they'd put them back online, and then they'd start pulling through to the BNSF. And then as I got near the crossover, then they'd stop and I could get off the train and we'd get a ride back to Hinkle. So it was pretty interesting for me and
Oh, it must
others.
have been.
Yeah. So and then like I said, we just dog catch sometimes down that way. But I never got to run on the Bend branch because that was not my territory.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, George.
No, that's
Um,
great.
So one of the comments in the chat, Scott, was when are you going to come back and do another program on the Northwest? So you knew that was coming. Let's just get that one out of the way now. Ken AB7X, in your dispatching career, did you ever dispatch much on the Oregon trunk?
No, I never dispatched that territory, but I did work as a telegrapher down there. That
Oh.
picture of the Bend Depot was especially refreshing because I actually worked what they call the Redmond Bend Relief Job. It was
Okay.
probably February of about 1972, I think, and I got cut off of the extra board and had options to bump into places like Third Trick Lester or the Bend Redmond Relief Job, and I chose the latter. No expenses, so you're on your own, but it was an experience I loved. I was on that job about 3 weeks before I could get back on the regular extra board and get back into the Tacoma area. But I had some of the most spectacular views of the sky back in there. I tell you, it gets really, really cold down there in February.
Yeah, it does.
But the sky is just crystal clear, and it was pretty spectacular. I lament that I didn't take pictures, but gosh, Scott, those pictures you took are way above and beyond anything that I could do, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and your description of things was thoroughly entertaining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Brent, do you want to put into the chat? You've got a comment and then put into the chat where people can watch this on YouTube. So,
Yeah,
go ahead, Brent.
I can do that for you. I also had a question, if that's okay. I don't know if
Yeah,
anyone
go
else.
right ahead.
My question is, you had showed a barge in one of your photos that was kind of abandoned. But my question is, was that being used for anything, or is that just kind of there as like a piece of history that's just kind of sat there? Do you know anything behind that? That was kind of cool.
I think that was actually a box car or an old maintenance of way camp car. And I'm not entirely sure what that was, but it was probably, it wouldn't surprise me if it was used as a fisherman's cabin and possibly for ranching or agriculture prior to that. And probably it had been abandoned there by the Harriman crews when they were building that line in the beginning of I think, around 1910 or so, probably from the construction. So I suspect it's been there for quite a long time out there in the high desert sun.
Sitting out there in the desert. I'll be down there on Saturday thinking about all of these great pictures, but I'm not a climber anymore. So
I'm gonna post that link for you guys. This talk obviously isn't gonna be up until we conclude it.
Right.
And then when we do, we will get that up for you. So
Great. And we're going to be concluding,
Thanks.
what a coincidence, what a great segue. We're going to be concluding here in just a couple of minutes. And if I got anything more from our audience today for Scott, it's a rare treat to have the executive director for Center for Railroad Photography and Art as our special guest to kick off our fall program. And it
Should
just,
we give him the weather report?
oh, we could do a weather report. What's the weather like in Madison?
It is warm and sunny here today. I think we're actually going to be up in the low 80s this week, so we're getting some real nice late summer weather here.
And Trent Stentz in the Rose City. How many square miles is Portland?
I have no idea.
Seattle.
I'll get
is
back to you on
80
that one.
Seattle is 84 square miles. I had to look that up this
I
morning.
would have guessed more. Madison 77, if anyone was
Okay.
Wow, there you go.
I'll
So
have to look that
Trent,
up.
weather conditions in
Oh,
the great state in the Rose City.
66 and cloudy. And a shameless plug for next year. The GN, NP, and SPNS conventions are combined next year in St. Paul. Should be a
Excellent.
great time.
St. Paul's
well
a great
done.
town.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic.
So that's a next year. I just got back from the SPS convention in Spokane.
And how was that?
Time. Oh, wonderful time.
Oh,
good,
yeah,
good
they're
people,
great.
good talks, and
Yeah.
I wandered around, saw lots of stuff.
Okay. Hey, Jim Davis, are you still with us? Jim, if you could just come on camera and unmute for a second, give us the weather conditions in Moscow, Idaho.
Yes, I'm actually just pulling up my phone, but it's damp and it's gray and it's smoky,
Yuck.
and so it's lovely. And my phone says it's 61 degrees.
Oh,
Just days ago, it was in the 90s.
Wow.
there you go. And
Got a little rain overnight.
and Rufus Cohn in the great state of Montana. Rufus, if you're with us, if you could give us a weather update from Montana. Don't know if Rufus is here or not. While we're waiting, I'm going to go to Gordon Glattenberg in Santa Clarita, California. Gordon.
Hi. Well, it's about 85 degrees here right now, sunny, which means it's dropped about 25 degrees from last week.
Well, okay. Well,
How close are those fires to you, Gordon?
Not very.
Good.
I'd say the closest is at least 40 miles.
Okay.
and I would be negligent if I didn't check with Joel McCurry from Cary, North Carolina. How is it in the great state of North Carolina, Joel, if you're there?
Yeah, we're here. We're sitting on 81 degrees and 61 square miles here in Cary.
There you go. We're getting our geography brought up to date. So if I missed anybody that wants to chime in with a weather forecast, how about Dale Sanders or George in Hermiston? Yeah, what's it like there?
Well, believe it or not, it's cool today. 67 degrees, but raining. So now I feel like I'm in the Puget Sound area.
There you go. And Rufus Cohn texts us that it's 69, and I believe Rufus is in Bozeman, Montana. So, Professor Cohn. So we are at 2 minutes past the hour, and Scott, great way to start a fall campaign with a
Thank you so much
just
for
a
having me
headlining, leadoff batter. So great stuff. And I have to say, I have a deep personal affection to Madison, of course. My mother was from Madison, and what is that team? The Badgers. That's right.
Yes.
Badger Mania is
They're-
upon us.
They're 2-0, but neither of those wins were nearly as convincing as we may have hoped here. So we'll see how the Big Ten season goes.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's a competitive get together in any case. I know my nephew Brent, who's on the program today, is an MSU grad.
Oh.
We got a few little Midwestern representation.
Well, our board member Kevin Keefe is a big MSU alum and fan and faithful, so there's a strong connection there.
Yeah, well, then they had the 1225 and all that.
Exactly.
So, the question is, will University of Wisconsin play Oregon this year? I don't know.
I don't think it's on the regular schedule, so maybe through some miracle of bowl configurations.
The whole thing has just kind of gone cattywampus on
It
the
really
center.
has.
I mean, long live the Pac-12 would be my
Right.
humble
Yeah,
Scott, Scott, do you have a message for Mark Ense?
Say that again, please.
Do you have a message for Mark Ense?
Tell him I said hello and that
I will.
I wish we were out rail fanning together in Oregon right now.
Yeah, I see him once in a while at Walla Walla. We
Oh.
eat there at the Maple Fountain Cafe. So
Yeah,
I'll
give
tell him
our
to
good
say
doctor
hi.
our regards.
Yes,
So,
please do, and have some great trips with him. With Jim Davis. Jim, you were up on that overlook above the bridge there at Wishroom at least once with us.
yeah. It's all good stuff. So 2:04 here on the west, 4 o'clock in the Midwest, 5 o'clock on the East Coast. So Brent, did you type in that chat where we're going to be? Did I see that?
Yep. So I typed it in. It's a weird link right now. I'm gonna try to.
So there it is. A couple people are asking, when are you going to be back? So Scott, you're on my list. And just so you know, I know how busy you are with everything all the cool stuff that you guys are doing at the center. So thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to be able to share this program with our group today. Really.
Oh, it was a lot of fun, and I'd love to do another one someday.
There you go. Well, we will stay in touch and remind your buddy Elrond that he's on my pack list of people to track down for the new year. So until our next program, which will be in 2 weeks from today, we're back in the saddle again. We'll have Bethan Mayer, and she will be talking about the absolutely stunning resurrection of the Mount Rainier Scenic Railway. When that
We
shut
have a
down,
question in the
just
chat.
like,
Sorry.
Dunkirk. So, did you have something more, Brent, before I let you go? Okay. So that'll be in 2 weeks, and that is just so Scott, I got to tell you this. I was up there last weekend shooting video at Mount Rainier Scenic, and they have their version of the Polar Express, and she sold 17,000 tickets in a week.
Well, those Polar Express trains can really be incredible, and that's a great. It's so exciting that Mount Rainier's open again.
Oh, it's just so exciting for them.
Fantastic resurrection.
The horror stories of when they shut down, when they took the bells and the builder's plates and the numbers off the locomotives and put them in the fireboxes and welded the fireboxes shut. I mean, she's at 36 years old, she is a very enthusiastic person. So that's something to look forward to in 2 weeks. If I don't hear anything more from the assembled masses, I'm just going to say everybody have a great day and enjoy September. And Scott, guaranteed, I'm going to see you again here soon. So thank you again, everybody, for being here. And we'll see our regular attendees in our program in 2 weeks. So
stop your recording before you shut down.
Okay, thank you, Byron. Thank you, Byron.